The achievements of SpaceX remain unabated. On Friday, Elon Musk's SpaceX eclipsed the previous record for the most rockets launched in a calendar year, which stood at 31. This was done in a feverish effort to deploy SpaceX's own internet satellites into space, which led to SpaceX breaking the record. After 367 days of preparation, a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket was able to successfully place 50 satellites into low Earth orbit. This marked the 57th time that a batch of operational Starlink satellites was safely delivered. So what does this mean for SpaceX, and is this the biggest achievement yet for SpaceX? Well, let's get started. During August, SpaceX continued to launch its Falcon 9 rockets from Launch Complex 39A in Florida despite the fact that construction on the adjoining tower for the company's next Starship rocket was making significant progress. To be ready for the launch of the subsequent set of Starlink internet satellites, SpaceX rolled another Falcon 9 to Pad 39A only a few hours after another section of the Starship gantry tower arrived at the launch pad. Later, the sixth of the 9 components of the Starship launch tower was moved to Pad 39 at the Kennedy Space Center. This relocation was accomplished using a self-propelled transporter. At the Starship orbital launch site, which is located around 1,000 feet east of the present Falcon 9 launch point, it was planned that a massive crane at Pad 39A would be used to lift the 5-story tall section on top of 5 pieces that were already piled there. There had been a total of 2,957 Starlink satellites launched by SpaceX prior to its most recent mission, which is classified as Starlink 426. This number includes both prototypes and older spacecraft designs that are no longer in service. Surprisingly, the total number of spacecraft that have been launched by the constellation has exceeded 3,000 after the completion of the Starlink 426 mission, which will involve the launch of 52 satellites. McDowell is an expert in monitoring the behavior of spacecraft in flight, and according to McDowell, the network now includes 2,400 operational satellites that are providing consumer broadband services, while the remaining satellites are in the process of aligning themselves for their ultimate orbital placements. A batch of operable Starlink satellites was successfully transported to low Earth orbit by a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket for the 57th time, marking the rocket's 50th successful launch in 367 days. Falcon 9 rocket V1063 lifted up for the 7th time at 7:40 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time, carrying a brand new upper stage as well as a new set of Starlink V1.5 satellites inside of a payload fairing that has been used before. During the Starlink 3-4 mission, which was SpaceX's 57th overall Starlink launch, an additional 46 satellites were deployed into a semi-polar sun-synchronous orbit. These satellites will eventually be joined in this orbit by around 520 other spacecraft. Approximately 9 minutes after liftoff, the expandable upper stage of the Falcon 9 rocket achieved a parking orbit that was stable, and booster B1063 successfully landed on a drone ship. This is SpaceX's 139th total landing, as well as their 65th consecutively successful landing. In December 2015, Falcon 9 successfully conducted its inaugural landing following its original launch in June 2010. Moreover, SpaceX Starlink 3-4 mission represented the company's 50th launch in like a year, the 148th consecutive flight of a Falcon 9 rocket to be successful, and the 172nd launch overall for the rocket that was successful. By the way, if you're watching us for the first time, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you can enjoy our future videos while getting updated. Now, getting back to the topic, in July of 2021, SpaceX began construction on the third orbital shell of Starlink, which was referred to as Group 3. After 4 launches and 7 weeks, more than half of the shell's projected 348 satellites are currently in orbit. However, the bulk of those spacecraft still requires a few more weeks or months to reach their operating heights. In the end, another 172 satellites will be produced in the 5th shell of SpaceX's first Starlink constellation. These satellites will be placed in a sun-synchronous orbit that is essentially identical to the current one. SSO satellites from Starlink will help bridge service gaps all across the world, but they will be especially appropriate for serving customers located at high latitudes, such as in the Arctic and Antarctic. They go around the planet with an inclination of 97.6 degrees, although a polar orbit at an angle of 90 degrees would be ideal. Once the constellation's orbital laser link network is fully operational, Starlink will be able to connect users even when they are outside of the range of the network's ground stations. This will be accomplished by rerouting communications through other satellites until a station is within range. The severe environment, a vast area of the continent, and low population density make it difficult to justify the construction of ground stations in extremely distant outposts such as those found in Antarctica. This might be a benefit for these kinds of outposts. In the not-too-distant future, semi-polar satellites similar to the one SpaceX launched today will make it possible to have an option that is more financially possible. Following the launch of Starlink 3 and 4, SpaceX now has over 2,900 operational Starlink satellites in orbit. This represents over 66% of the total 4,408 satellites that make up the constellation. According to astronomer Jonathan McDowell, around 2,400 satellites have reached operational orbits and are currently offering services to customers on Earth. This represents more than half of the complete constellation. Less than 3 years have passed since SpaceX began launching satellites using its Starlink service in November 2019. And in order to satisfy the standards set out by the FCC, the company was required to successfully launch 2,408 satellites by March 2027 and must have successfully launched half of the constellation by March 2024. But let's agree, SpaceX has revolutionized the space industry. Reusable rockets and spacecraft technology are the foundation upon which SpaceX sets its cost forecasts, which are often lower than those of the company's competitors. For instance, according to the Office of the Inspector General at NASA in 2019, the cost per seat for SpaceX Crew Dragon is approximately $55 million. This is approximately 60% less expensive than the cost for both the Boeing Starliner, estimated at $90 million, and the Russian Soyuz, at that time, $85 million. Now consider, for the sake of extra perspective, that SpaceX provides launches of its Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy vehicles for prices of $62 million and $90 million respectively, which are much less expensive than those of its primary competitors. For instance, the cost of a ride in late 2020 on the Atlas V rocket, which is a workhorse for United Launch Alliance, would be somewhat higher than $100 million. Essentially, the Falcon 9 outperforms the Atlas V in terms of overall power. Launch customers are required to pay varying amounts in accordance with the norm of the business in order to ride aboard Falcon 9 or Falcon Heavy. So, for example, a fleet of tiny CubeSats from multiple firms may, on average, pay less for their rideshare than the owner of the principal satellite, which is riding atop a Falcon 9 on the same flight. This is because the primary satellite is being carried by SpaceX. In the future, there is a possibility that expenses will be reduced. To provide one example, it is estimated that the incredibly weighty Starship system will only require fuel with a value of $900,000 in order to reach Earth orbit. In 2019, Musk forecast that the operational cost of each trip may be as low as $2 million. If this is the case, Starship will be a true game changer since it will bring down the space travel cost. It was once a remarkable achievement in rocket science, but is now considered standard practice for companies like SpaceX to recover and reuse the first stages of rockets like the Falcon 9 and the Falcon Heavy. In point of fact, the company's ability to keep costs under control is contingent on the reuse of materials in this manner. About 9 minutes after launch, the returning rockets make soft vertical landings either on flat terrain close to the launch pad or on unmanned drone ships in the middle of the ocean. These landings take place approximately 9 minutes after the rockets have been launched. In December 2021, the company completed its 100th rocket landing, which came 6 years after it completed its first orbital flight with a rocket that successfully landed after completing its mission. When it comes to lowering launch costs and boosting launch frequency, SpaceX places a strong emphasis on the utilization of reusable rockets. Moreover, the business intends to launch often, in particular in relation to the launch of its Starlink constellation. At the current time, the Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy rockets are only partially reusable because the upper stages of each are discarded following the launch of their respective vehicles. Nevertheless, every component of the Starship Super Heavy system will be utilized again and again. Moreover, seeing the Super Heavy landings will be an incredible experience. And it's a wrap. Anyway, do you think that SpaceX will end up dominating the industry? Comment below. Also, please leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell for more amazing videos.